In theme number 1 of Peter's The Greatest Story Ever Sold, he talks about there being signs in the stars. He recognizes this, and he also states that they are grouped into constellations and personified. It is true that God did put stars in the heavens and group them into constellations to serve as signs and for seasons. If you believe in the scriptures, you can see this for yourself in what John revealed in Revelation chapter 12. You can also see this as explained by God in Genesis chapter 1 verse 14. Unfortunately, it was man who personified God's creation. They are definitely there for signs and seasons and to herald earthly events as stated by ancient prophets, by Jesus, and by apostles such as John the Revelator. The presence of the constellations and the fact that they provide landmarks for earthly events should not lead one to focus only on the stars and completely disregard those earthly occurrences. In the second theme of Peter's The Greatest Story Ever Sold, he makes a claim that the Sun, the center of our universe, equals God's Son, and that the Savior of mankind is a personification of that center of our universe. Unfortunately, what he's done is interchange Son, S-U-N, and Son, S-O-N, to manipulate people into equating the two terms. Jesus was a real human whose birth, death, and resurrection were foretold centuries in advance. Many people witnessed these things and wrote about them. His role as the Savior of mankind was also prophesied and had nothing to do with astrology, although signs in the heavens did herald Jesus' coming. In his third theme, Peter claims that the Egyptian sun god Horus was a solar messiah, just like Jesus Christ. Horus was a mythological sun god that was in Egypt apparently from about 3000 BCE, and he provides the basis for a Jesus story, again according to Peter. He claims that Horus, Jesus, and others are just solar messiahs, broadly speaking, to use his terms. Let's take a look at some of his claims where he compares Jesus to the sun god Horus. Although you are unlikely to find any support for Peter's claims that Jesus and Horus are one and the same, or for any of their mythological comparisons to Jesus for that matter, I certainly encourage you to do your own research. Here are a couple of URLs you can check out, but definitely do the research for yourself. In Peter's theme 4, he compares Attis, Krishna, Dionysus, and Mithra to Jesus Christ. He claims they resemble the story of him. Much of the information presented when trying to compare Attis, Krishna, Dionysus, and Mithra to Jesus is completely false. You won't find the majority of the claims in historical or cultural writings. Again, these falsehoods were most likely thrown in to deceive and lend credibility to a claim that Jesus was a myth despite all the fulfilled prophecies and eyewitness accounts. Jesus' coming was foretold hundreds of years in advance in the form of many prophecies fulfilled by his life, death, and resurrection, all witnessed by hundreds of people. The others, such as Attis, Dionysus, and Mithra, were myths accentuating sun god worship born of true-to-life characters of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz in roughly 2100 BCE. Nimrod, the grandson of Noah, married his mother Semiramis. Together they instituted rebellion against God and facilitated the building of the Tower of Babel. Nimrod was killed and torn to pieces. Semiramis became pregnant, claiming it was the child and reincarnation of her dead husband and son, Nimrod. Her son, Tammuz, was killed by a wild boar at age 40. The worship of him and his mother and Nimrod spawned the mother-son worship we often see today, and the worship of Nimrod as a god spawned the worship we later began seeing in the likes of Adonis and Mithra. We see accounts of the flood and the worship of several similar characters. That should come as no surprise. Nimrod lived just after the flood, and the peoples dispersed by God by changing their language during the building of the Tower of Babel would have carried the flood and Nimrod, Tammuz, Semiramis worship stories with them as they moved into various regions surrounding the Mesopotamia. Lineage from the book of Genesis lends credibility to the existence of Nimrod and his kingdom at about 2100 BCE. Ezekiel's vision of Tammuz, the son of Nimrod and Semiramis, 1500 years later, lends credibility to his existence and the story of his birth, death, and of their worship. Are a few stills from Peter's video. They show the comparisons he makes between Attis, Krishna, and Mithra to Jesus. Again, I challenge you to research these things on your own, as you're unlikely to find any supporting evidence. And for those of you interested in starting your own research, here are a few URLs you may want to begin with. But again, do your due diligence and definitely research this. I think what you'll discover truly is that these myths certainly came from the ancient Babylonian sun god worship just after the flood. In theme number 5, Peter questions the characteristics of Christ. In particular, he asks why the virgin birth was on December 25th. He questions being dead for 3 days and then resurrected, or why there were 12 disciples or followers. So let's address these one at a time. Regarding the virgin birth and December 25th, other mythological figures may have been born of a miracle or unusual birth, i.e. Semiramis' impregnation by her dead husband, or Isis' impregnation by her dead reconstructed husband, and again these are related and based on the same Babylonian sun god stories. However, Jesus was the only one who fulfilled ancient prophecies by being born of a virgin, someone who had never had intercourse before, unlike the mythological mothers I just mentioned. Jesus was not born on December 25th, and I want to repeat this. He was not born on December 25th. Historical evidence surrounding his birth and the census put him at a much different date. So do the stars and signs in the heavens. This was propagated by the early Roman Catholic Church, influenced by Constantine, who was a worshipper of the sun god Mithra, born on December 25th, the winter solstice. The context again of Caesar Augustus' census and the fact that the animals were in the fields with the shepherds instead of inside shelter suggests Jesus was most likely born much later, perhaps late spring, early summer, not at the pagan winter solstice. So why dead for 3 days and raised? This was the prophecy, i.e. the sign of Jonah that Jesus gave, and fulfillment of the Jewish tradition, as with others Jesus fulfilled or will fulfill at his second coming. Resurrection was necessary to not only also fulfill tradition, but to allow continuation of mankind's salvation. So why 12 disciples or followers? There's no indication that Horus or the others had 12 disciples, even though this is what Peter claims. Again, this is thrown in to confuse. The number 12 is used to reflect completion, which may be why Jesus had 12 disciples. Peter, in his 6th theme, claims that Jesus' birth was purely mythological and astrological. Well, first of all, to his claim that Jesus was a myth, Peter calls Jesus the most recent solar Messiah. This is ridiculous and a label based on pure conjecture and a disregard for physical evidence of Jesus' existence. He claims that Jesus was born on December 25th. Again, this shows his ignorance, since nothing in ancient writings suggests that date. But context and historical evidence of the census places Jesus' birth much, much later, again in late spring, perhaps in the summertime. In his claim that Jesus' birth sequence was purely astrological, Peter cites an astrological alignment of Sirius, the star in the east, with 3 stars on Orion's belt, called the Three Kings, on December 24th, to prove Jesus' birthday on December 25th is purely astrological. And again, Jesus was not born on December 25th. Peter claims the virgin birth didn't happen. Here, he says that Mary the Virgin is the constellation Virgo, Virgin. Fine, God did put signs in the heavens, as already discussed. They represent and sometimes herald earthly events. This doesn't erase the eyewitness accounts of Mary or her Jewish lineage, which is very specific and should be checked out. It also doesn't negate the prophecies of the virgin birth or the written accounts of her impregnation or the birth of Jesus. And I understand there's some controversy as to how Mary was connected to the house of David. That connection to David was through Mary, not Joseph. The translation of Matthew's writing is a little bit messed up in this regard and wrongly leads one to believe that the opposite is true. However, again, it doesn't change the recorded history or the facts. Finally, Peter states that Bethlehem is purely a place in the sky. This is amazingly dumb and must be a trick statement otherwise, since Bethlehem is a place in Israel and history and does indeed exist. He does call Bethlehem the house of bread, which is accurate. However, it is and has been a legitimate geographical location in prophecy and in history, and you can find it today. In theme 7 of Peter's video, he claims that Christ's death and resurrection were purely astrological. He equates the transition of summer to winter and the resulting shortening of the days and death of the sun to the crucifixion of Jesus. Again, this is purely conjecture conjecture. Again, Christ wasn't born on December 25th, and the death and resurrection of Christ, which were definitely witnessed and written about, had nothing to do directly with astrological signs. Peter also states that the cross was purely astrological. He goes on to recite that the sun appears to stand still in the vicinity of the southern cross, crux, December 22nd through 24th. Jesus did die on a real wooden cross as witnessed by several people regardless of the astrological signs, symbolizing death and rebirth. The cross was a very common and well-documented method of torture and death practiced in Jesus' time. In the final part of Theme 7, Peter claims that from the astrological death we see resurrection of life that brings spring and salvation, to use his words, again a personification to try to represent what Jesus actually did and make it sound like a myth, to counter any questions about why the celebration of Easter doesn't actually happen until springtime. Then Peter goes on to state that this resurrection wasn't celebrated until the spring equinox. The idea of comparing Christ's death and resurrection to spring bringing salvation is ridiculous and pure conjecture. A very real Christ has offered a very real salvation to mankind in the fulfillment of ancient prophecies despite the astrological signs. In Theme 8 of his video, Peter claims that the disciples were purely astrological, that they were 12 constellations. He also discusses the use of number 12 extensively throughout the Bible. More in these to follow. Peter claims that the 12 disciples are 12 constellations. This is pure conjecture and a total disregard for the writings of those individuals and others who traveled with them. Historical evidence and writings prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the disciples existed and they were executed for their faith. We have not only the writings of some of the disciples and apostles, but also of their disciples and of early church fathers such as Polycarp, the disciple of John, and Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp. Finally, Peter discusses in his video that the number 12 is used extensively throughout the Bible. That is true. It is used extensively, but its use to indicate completion doesn't negate those biblical things in that quantity. In Theme number 9, Peter claims that Jesus and the cross were purely astrological. He equates the cross to the cross of the zodiac. History staunchly supports and proves that the cross was a very real form of torture and death used by the Romans during the time of their authority in what we now know as Europe and in the Middle East. A claim that the cross is purely astrological or that it's a story based on pagan symbols disregards the accounts of Jesus' death on the cross and of the instrument of death itself, in which there are numerous accounts. Peter also notes that Jesus is always depicted with his head on the cross. That's right. He is depicted with his head on the cross because, well, it's where somebody's head would be when they're being killed on it.